A D+ barely counts as a passing grade, but the Chesapeake Bay Foundation says that's where our bay stands. Better, but not great. The headline from that report was the blue crab population, which had plummeted to less than half the 2012 count.
Certainly a concern, Jamie, but maybe one of the highlights of this year's report is another fishery of our bay, oysters, a species some say is experiencing the beginning of an incredibly important rebound. Chucky White and the Jennifer Ann pulled up along Harris Seafood in Graysonville on a cold December afternoon to unload the haul.
So they see that ticket's on that basket.
This day's catch is about half the 30 basket limit per boat. He blames the weather for that, but on so many other days, the harvest is at or near the max. A more and more common catch these last couple of years. How's the harvest been so far this year?
It's been good so far. It's not as good as last year, but they didn't grow as good.
Okay. But he's not choosing because, well, many watermen aren't begging. While last year was a record harvest for oysters, this year will be nearly as good. Chesapeake oysters, it seems, are on the rebound.
We're seeing a great resurgence of the oyster industry, a renaissance of the oyster industry here in the Chesapeake Bay. With the aquaculture coming on board, as well as a great harvest that we're having with the wild product, we're seeing people recognize Chesapeake Bay oysters as a brand again.
And it's Steve Vilnit's job to push them. The director of fisheries marketing for the Maryland DNR is selling the idea that not only are Chesapeake oysters back, but they are as unique and as tasty as its more famous blue crab neighbor. From the Chesapeake farm to the tables around the nation.
And we're really trying to brand stuff, where it's coming from, what river it's coming from, what part of the bay it's coming from, just to let people know that this is a local product that's harvested, and these guys are out there working hard every day through the winter.
A rise in awareness means a rise in demand, which means a rise in price. The solid economics of this fishery and its newfound population is the goal, but not at any price.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Corporal Murray Hunt is just one of many natural resources police spot checking the watermen and their catches to make sure the oysters coming out of the bay are not the ones the state says should stay in. A job officers of this force have been doing since the early 1800s.
How often do you guys do this kind of inspections?
About every day. We either do it while we're out on patrol, out on a boat. As it gets later in the afternoon, we'll do roadside inspections, and we'll do inspections like we are today here at the seafood market.
The oysters need to be at least 3 inches long. If more than 5% of the waterman's catch is below that size, increasingly stiffer penalties and citations are given. Much like what a Virginia man found out last January when the NRP made this bust in Easton along Route 50. Of 188 bushels on a tractor trailer headed out of state, police say all but one had up to 50% of undersized Chesapeake oysters. This case was eventually thrown out by an Eastern Shore judge, but NRP is constantly patrolling to protect oysters. In the last 5 seasons, the force has issued more than 550 citations and nearly 700 warnings.
I find it personally rewarding to do. It's a lot of work. These bushel baskets weigh a lot, and being bent over on your knees, it's pretty easy in a parking lot, but out on a boat that's rocking and rolling, get seasick sometimes, just happens. And you're cold, and you're wet, and muddy.
The enforcement is key to the Chesapeake oyster resurgence. A lot of time and money has gone into restoration efforts, including increasing man-made oyster sanctuaries by 15% since 2010. Oysters need a hard surface to latch onto and grow, surfaces like these reef balls that have been dropped into the bay to foster reproduction. Areas the NRP vigorously protects, and now with some new technology. What you're looking at here is a new radar they use. The red box is the sanctuary, clearly marked with GPS and buoys. The blue is Tangier Sound on the lower bay. That gray lollipop shape is a boat that was tracked dredging for oysters in the protected area. This poacher was arrested and convicted last year in Somerset County, one of 23 successful cases since this new radar came online. But those oysters that can come out of the bay are being harvested at numbers Maryland hasn't seen since the late 1980s. A renaissance as delicate as the ecosystem of the bay itself. With equal parts restoration, harvest, enforcement, and marketing, the Chesapeake oyster is beginning its comeback.
It's good, at least they're still alive. You know, that's the good thing.
Alive, and the hope is, well. So it was back in 2010 that the state bumped up those oyster sanctuaries by 15%. Next year, it will study the 5-year impact of that decision to determine if it was a deciding factor in the resurgence of the oyster population. Meanwhile, aggressive enforcement continues. Just this morning, 2 more watermen were charged with trying to poach oysters out of that very same Tangier Sound sanctuary. While a popular target because of how remote the area is, the NRP's radar can now equalize that. The 14 bushels that were returned to the bay, both men now face fines and suspension of their license.